Hello and welcome to a special bonus Postcards from a Dying World. It's just me. I'm just going to talk to you about the books that I read this year. I read 100. I have 100 reads this year. Some are graphic novels, some are magazine journals, that kind of thing. But I read 100 of them. And so I'm going to give you a thumbnail review of all of them. But before I do that, this year in 2022, I released this novel through Grand Ball Press alongside that's my third book with Grand Ball Press, but this one is with Anthony Trevino, my co-host on the Dickheads podcast, and it's science fiction, horror, crime. Let's see, Desmond Reddick from Dread Media Podcast said combines police procedural, conspiracy thriller, science fiction, horror into a tightly plotted page turner. So yeah, that's Desmond, who's been on this podcast before. So yeah, believe him and pick up Nightmare City because I'm really, really, really proud of it. And my next novel after that, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, is already up for pre-sale. And if you like books about killing Nazis, World War II Men on a Mission, and monster novels, I got you covered. That comes out probably in August from Clash Books. It's definitely coming out in the summer, and really excited about that. But before we get into, so what I'm going to do here is all 100 books that I read this year, and I still have like 50 pages left on book 100, but I'm going to read that before midnight, so I'm going to count that. But for my year in books, I've read 25,067 pages, so add like 50 to that, so it's going to be 21. So it's going to be 25, 100 and something. I'm bad at math. 100 books. The shortest book I read was a novella by Philip K. Dick. It was 42 pages. The longest book I read was These Are the Voyages, season 1, which is a book about Star Trek. Well, I'm going to get into all of those. The average book length that I read was 253 pages. The most shelved book that I read was Fairy Tale by Stephen King. Well, I'll talk to you about that. And then the least shelved was Startling Stories, which is an annual journal magazine. But we'll get into all that. But anyways, we're going to review every single book that I read, all 100. So this is going to be a little different from my best books of the year. The best books of the year is going to be delayed for a little bit. It's going to be the next episode of the podcast, but my homie and co-host on that episode, Mark Rothenberg, is in Norway until the 6th of January, so we're going to record it then. So the first book that I read this year was The Happening Worlds of John Brunner, A Critical Explorations in Science Fiction by Joe DeBlanc. And this was a book that was written in the mid-70s about how amazing John Brunner was, and he still did a lot of stuff after that. So, and I had just before that read the Modern Masters of Science Fiction, John Brunner one. So that went through his whole life, and I think that's a little better. The first fiction that I read of the year was If It Bleeds by Stephen King. And like, these are just gonna be thumbnail reviews off the top of my head. If It Bleeds, like King is really good at novellas, and so his novellas, excuse me, are really good. Generally, this wasn't the best collection. Full Dark No Stars was all bangers, and I remember this one. I just there was one novella that I kind of liked, and then he ended up basically reusing it and recycling the plot for his novel that came out this year, but we'll talk about that eventually. A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick, of course, a masterpiece and a classic, and our episode of Dickheads, co-starring John Shirley. Cyberpunk legend John Shirley, I think, is the best episode of the Dickheads podcast. We had to take the timeline and the history part of what was going on in Phil's life and break it into a separate episode because the episode was so good. Next, I read Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, radical science fiction from 1950 to 1985 Andrew Nettie, and there was another author, Ian McIntyre. Ian McIntyre. It's on my shelf right behind me. This is a fantastic like coffee table like style book about radical science fiction, and it has lots of pictures and great articles. I wasn't impressed by a few of the articles, like the Philip K. Dick article is real basic. The Barry Malzberg one doesn't really say enough about him, and I think some things could have gone a little deeper, but overall it's a great book. It's really important, and people should definitely pick it up if they're interested in the history of science fiction. If you're noticing a pattern here, I read a lot of nonfiction about science fiction for the podcast. And the next book I read was an anthology, an Eric Gignard Dark Moon Books anthology called Professor Charlatan Bardot's Travel Anthology to the Most Fictional Haunted Buildings in the Weird Wild World. And this is a amazing anthology. And the way Eric wrote this was like a travel book. So it's very short stories, but it has stories from all over the world, and it's one of the coolest anthologies I've seen in a long time. Next, with from editor Sherry Renee Thomas, is I became a subscriber for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So a lot of the reads of this year, and these are like 200-page, they're practically anthologies, every 2 months. So it's like hitting 6 anthologies in the mailbox every year. The magazine of fantasy and science fiction has been going since the 50s. Started by Thomas and Tony Boucher, and I really believe in supporting their mission. And then the next book I read was Philip K. Dick in his own words, which is all interviews with Greg Rickman, who I met in 2021. And what's cool is that I couldn't find this book for very cheap, and Zach Woods, who's a listener of the Dickheads podcast, sent me his copy, or sent me a copy, because it was a little bit more expensive than I could afford at the time. I have a hard time spending like $50 or $100 for a book that I'm going to highlight, and I've used it a lot in research for the podcast. So also, excuse me, Dickheads related, we did an episode featuring Grant Womack and Cora Bullard for The Big Jump by Lee Brackett, which was the next book that I read. And this is my favorite Lee Brackett novel. It was originally published do-si-do, meaning it was a split paperback with Philip K. Dick's first novel, Solar Lottery. And so we did a Dick Adjacent episode, because you can't get more Dick Adjacent than that, for Lee Brackett, The Big Jump. And this book is awesome. Like hard science fiction for the times of the 50s. It's kind of horror sci-fi about like how like crazy it is to go to deep space. Now, the next book I read was Far from the Light of Heaven, which is a African futurist science fiction novel from Tad Thompson. And I don't remember this one super well, but I remember I liked it. I thought it was really good at the time. So yeah, Far from the Light of Heaven by Tad Thompson. I mean, you can go check out my review when it was fresh in my brain. But I know I really liked it. So it's weird, like I don't remember it very well, but I just remember really enjoying it. So next I read Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. And this is the novel that's a little different from the finished film, has a different ending. And, I like Quentin a lot as a writer. I know some people, if you don't like Quentin as a person, you're not going to like this novel. I think if you like the film, you should read the book, because it is a little different and it gives a little more detail. The next thing I read after that was a Star Wars graphic novel, and this was There Is No Fear, High Republic #1. And this is the introduction of a whole new era of Star Wars, and I was going to eventually read the novels. So I wanted to read this graphic novel because it gives you like what the characters look like and all that. In this High Republic era, what they did is they put together a writer's room to plan the novels, comic books, and we're actually going to get a TV show set in the New Republic era called The Acolyte soon. So that's exciting. And the next nonfiction book I read was Celestial Empire, The Emergence of Chinese Science Fiction by Nathaniel Isaacson, who was a one-time guest on the Asian Science Fiction and Translation episode of the Dickheads podcast. And this book is really cool. It dives into the history of how science fiction kind of developed and came to be as a genre. They were actually kind of using the term science fiction or a translated version of it, like almost like simultaneously with Gernsback, and so really cool history and very important books. So highly recommended. Next I read The Feverish, and now look, the nonfiction and the fiction I kind of read overlapping. So this is which the order in which I finished it. And the next one that I finished anyways was The Feverish Stars, New and Uncollected Stories by John Shirley. And if anybody knows, John Shirley is one of my favorite authors. You're going to hear his name a couple more times in this list. I've worked with John on a screenplay, and John's a very good friend and mentor. Has mentored me, and he wrote the introduction to my short story collection, Amazing Punk Stories, but that's besides the point. This Feverish Stars collection, John just really vital, still writing really vital science fiction, very political science fiction. There's a few Lovecraftian stories because John writes great Lovecraftian stuff, but the political science fiction is where it's at in this one. Spoiler alert, this will be on my best reads of the year, so I will go into more detail on that show. So coming up, Bergdorf and Associates, which was a arc that I got in the mail from an author, and I hope I don't butcher this name, Thomas C. Mavrudis, Mavrudis, who's a Denver-based horror writer, and I wasn't a big fan of this one, so I read it and reviewed it because I got a free copy, and but I don't have much to say on it. So, and I don't remember it very well. It's kind of like a monster story, and I know there were some structural problems with it, but the guy's talented, so I'm gonna keep my eye out for this author, see if there's other stuff that I like. But yeah. Okay, so next up is Anthem by Noah Hawley. Now, Noah Hawley is known as a filmmaker, and he made oh god, what was that sci-fi movie he made with Natalie Portman? I don't remember. He made Legion, he made Fargo, he wrote all through seasons of the show Fargo. He's a really talented writer. He was a novelist too. And somewhere around like 2020, he wrote this very 2020 novel called Anthem. And it's like it's kind of it seems like it's setting up to be The Stand, but it's more like kind of like Vonnegut, a little bit satire of 2020. It's a really interesting book. I liked it. Yeah, I mean, I didn't love it, but next was Kiss of Life, the untold saga of America's Last Outlaws, which was like kind of written by Gene O'Neill and Gord Rollo. And Gene O'Neill wrote one of my all-time favorite horror short stories, The Burden of Indigo, and big fan of like his novels and stories that are set in that universe. Gene's a really talented writer. This is kind of like a more historical, like realistic version of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or those characters. At least that's my memory of it. Wasn't super fond of this one, but Gene's Yeah, I'm always happy to read what Gene's got going on. So yeah, but for people who like westerns, I think it's a cool thing. So The Heart of Drenger, the Star Wars High Republic graphic novel number 2. So this is the second graphic novels of the High Republic, and I read this one too. There's a Wookiee Jedi in the High Republic, which is pretty cool. I don't remember much about the story, to be honest with you. So The Secret Skin by Wendy N. Wagner, which was a gothic novella, and very good. And I had Wendy on the podcast, so I recommend The Secret Skin. It's about 100 pages, maybe even a little less. So it's a quick read. And then I know the library here in San Diego got it. Another novella, The Annual Migration of Clouds, which was a sci-fi novel by Primi Mohammed, who's a Canadian author, I believe. This is a very kind of weird, hard sci-fi climate change thing. And yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that I should have liked about this book. And I'm definitely going to read more of her work because some of the other stuff sounded really, really, really good. And there are a few moments that were really cool, but I don't remember this book very well. So, and the thing is I read it right before one of the best reads of the year. Spoiler alert for my best reads of the year, which was Ice by Anna Kavan, which is a classic from the 60s, post-apocalyptic, surreal apocalyptic novel about a woman who's going through some like a psychotic episode as ice begins to take over the world in a creeping apocalypse. And it is incredible. It's a classic for a reason. I'll talk more about it in my best reads of the year, because that's one of my best retro reads. Next, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction number 759 was a January-February issue. Trying to think. I think, let me look. The best story I know, according to my review, my 2 favorite stories was doe_heaven.vr by Kara Mast and City and the Thing Beneath by Innocent Elo, which was a VR story. Okay, I apparently I liked those stories a lot, but I don't remember. To be honest with you, I don't remember them. So that was February. So next was The Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule, who I just heard a really cool interview with him on Kingcast. He did an episode about Firestarter. And this is the first novel, the kind of kickoff story, the official first story of the High Republic era. And I listened to this on audiobook from the Libby app, the library app. And it's kind of dramatized with sound effects and Star Wars music. And it's really good. There's a crisis and an asteroid that's gonna destroy this planet, and the Jedi gotta try and save them. And it's introduces a new foe. It's really good stuff. So next, I read a short story collection by Lisa Morton called Night Terrors and Other Tales. Lisa is one of the best short story writers. She's very influenced. I would compare her work to like Dennis Etchison, maybe, or even maybe a little bit of a Brian Evanson. Lisa is an incredible writer in general, but she's a fantastic short story writer. And there's a couple of these that are very sharp and political novellas. Just really interesting stuff. So next I read Thou Good and Faithful, the novella by John Brunner, which was in his 1965 collection, Now Then. is what is one place you can find it. And there's a lot of debate because John Brunner considers this his first story ever, like his first sale, but technically he had like he had stories and zines like two or three times before that, but this is his first like major work, like, and it was in analog, it was a cover story in analog. And man, this is really good. It's got a very Clifford Mac feel to it. He was a teenager when he wrote it, and there's already like pretty interesting science out of date now. There's like social awareness, ecological themes, and it would be impressive for somebody writing it today, but it was really impressive for somebody writing it then. And it's a really deep and thoughtful science fiction story. I highly recommend it. So that's Thou Good and Faithful. You can get it if you can find his 1965 collection now, then it's in that. I don't know, the Internet Archive might have the analog issue, so you might be able to read it online there. It's really good. Next, I read Fan Fiction by Brent Spiner, which is Brent's, played Data. And this is kind of a meta-fictional, like, he called it mem noir. So it imagines that he was involved in like a murder mystery. And there's a lot of Star Trek in jokes. It's very fun. So next I read Goliath by, and I hope I don't butcher his name, Tochi Onibuchi, who is a Nigerian American writer, and this book is called Goliath. Spoiler alert, it's going to be on my best reads of the year. And Goliath is a brutal, really intense science fiction novel. Very, very good. It's not going to be for everybody. It's a little bit of a slow burn. It takes a little while to go. And he really trusts his audience, and he doesn't spoon feed you. So it's it's not the lightest of reads. Okay, so Strange Adventures, which was a very thick graphic novel collecting a 12-issue run of this DC series that was supposed to be kind of space. It's like a retro space opera 50s style story, kind of set in the kind of Green Lantern corner of the DC universe. And I think I just saw a tweet about it. I think Juan San Miguel was tweeting about it. I thought it looked interesting, and then I saw that our library had it, so I put a hold on it. And yeah, I was glad I read it. It's cool. I'm not going to read more of it. I'm not going to read anything again. But and this next stretch of books, starting with Goliath, the one before it, I was on a tear of really good books. A lot of the best books I read of the year. Next was Noor by Nnedi Okorafor, and this is a transhuman African futurist story about augmented humans and a love story set in Nigeria. It's like short. I think it's one of Nnedi Okorafor's best works, and I love the Binti books. I'm a big Nnedi Okorafor fan, and I really appreciated this one. So yeah, good one. And then Manhunt by Gretchen Flecker Martin. And I had Gretchen on the podcast, so there's more coverage of that. Manhunt is a modern transcentric take on the Screwfry solution, the James Tiptree, aka Alice Sheldon classic, and kind of modern updating of it. And it's really, really good. Now, this book was like, and if you go and look up the cover, Manhunt, you'll see like this was a very controversial book over the year, and the transphobic and the TERFs and the people like that, they really hated this book. They really hated this book. And Gretchen was awesome in fighting all of it back. And she shouldn't have had to have done all that, but it's a really cool book, and I recommend my interview with her. I think it's good stuff. And then another really great book I read was How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu, and who's a Minneapolis author. And I will say more in the best of books, but this is very similar to Cloud Atlas. It's basically a short story collection that ties together loosely into a novel. I would say it ties together a little better than Cloud Atlas. But man, there's one of the stories in there is about an amusement park for euthanizing kids. So it's like they're gonna have a lot of fun before they get euthanized. It's set against a pandemic, and that is a really brutal story. There was one story that I didn't care for, but it has to do with things that just I don't like. So is a very personal thing. So don't hold it against the book. I didn't hold it against the book, even though I thought one part of it was silly. A lot of it has to do with my views as a militant vegan. So you can read about that in my review if you're curious. Okay, so after that, I listened to a Star Trek audiobook. Homie of the podcast, guest twice, Greg Cox, his Star Trek novel, The Antares Maelstrom. And what Greg did here that was really cool was there's lots for everybody to do of all like the major characters, and he puts them all in different spots. And Sulu has a lot of really good stuff to do in this book, and uh, you know, it's perfect that Greg would build an entire novel off one line of dialogue from Wrath of Khan. So it's very him. Next was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction number 760, the March April issue. And if I recall, who was in that issue? Oh, there's a really good Phoenix Alexander piece. That was a piece I really liked in that one. And then I read an Australian cyberpunk novel called 36 Streets by T.R. Napper, and it was pretty good. Yeah, it was pretty good. I kind of wish I liked it a little more, but I liked it. It's very long. And there's obviously I reviewed everything when it came out. So if you want more detailed thoughts on that one, but yeah. So then I read Man Who Fell to Earth by Walter Tevis. And this was right around the time that the TV show The Man Who Fell to Earth on Showtime from Alex Kurtzman and like basically the Star Trek team. It was on Showtime, and very underrated show this year. And I loved the novel, and I went on a tear here to read all the Walter Tevis that I hadn't read. I had read Mockingbird before and Queen's Gambit, and so I had to fill in the gaps there. So and so you'll see a couple other Walter Tevises coming up here, and that was the Sci-Fi Masterworks edition, and this will start a stretch of some Sci-Fi Masterworks that I read. The next book, another podcast guest, Gavriel Rosenfeld, Dr. Gavriel Rosenfeld, who was on the Dickhead's Man in the High Castle interview bonus special. And that's for obvious reasons. He's the author of this book that I read, The World Hitler Never Made, The Alternate History and Memory of Nazism. Now, this is like a very exhaustive study of every alternate World War II story, from like Night of the Generals to Man in the High Castle to the Iron Dream, all of it. And it's a really exhaustive study. And I added probably 40 to 60 books to my want to read list from Goodreads while reading this book, reading and highlighting this book. Great read. And then this another episode that we did a podcast about for Dickheads. I read The Stars My Destination by Alfred Bester because I had D. Harlan Wilson on, and I read his He just wrote a book on that novel called Alfred Bester's The Star Is My Destination, A Critical Companion, D. Harlan Wilson. So I read both and had Professor Wilson on the Dickheads podcast. So you should listen to that. The next nonfiction that I read was All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days, the True Story of the American Woman at the Heart of the German Resistance to Hitler by Rebecca Donner. And this is a biography of a woman who was a resistance fighter inside Nazi Germany in the 30s and was executed by Hitler. It's a really incredible book and sad and depressing. So, but very interesting. Next, I read Norman Spinrad's script for He Walked Among Us, which was an episode of Star Trek that was meant to guest star Milton Berle, and it's very bad. It's very bad, and Spinrad knew it, but he took the job and got paid. So there are a few funny moments, but it's not good. It didn't get made for a reason. And Gene Coon did a pass on it, and it still sucked. Then I read Far From Home, the speculative fiction of Walter Tevis. And this is half stories that he wrote in the 60s, and then he took a big break from writing when he was teaching and was drinking a lot. And he didn't write for many, many years until the 80s. So half the book is older stories from the 50s and 60s, and then half is from the 80s. It's all good. It's all very, very, very good. And I read that back to back with two other Walter Tevis novels. I read The Hustler, which is his classic about pool halls, and it's really good. It's a classic for a reason. It's not my normal type of stuff I read, but Tevis is such a great writer. It works really well. Then I read his last science fiction novel, The Steps of the Sun, which I read before years ago, but I didn't really know anything about Tevis. I didn't, know what I was reading, and so this reading was very different. And it's weird because all of Tevis's other books are all considered classics for one reason or another, and this is kind of like Redheaded Stepchild, his last sci-fi novel, and it's really weird. It's kind of corny, and but it's got some really interesting things. I highly recommend my review. I put a lot of energy into all those Walter Tevis reviews. So yeah. And the next nonfiction book I read was Monster She Wrote. Now you see why I made that mistake. The women who pioneered horror and speculative fiction. There's, I believe, 3 authors. No, just 2. Lisa Kruger, Melanie R. Anderson. And eventually, I want to do a podcast that's Lisa Morton, Lisa Kruger, and Lisa Yazik, all Lisas, who wrote about women writing fiction in this era, because, oh, look, the sun came out. It's been raining here in San Diego. I actually played basketball in the rain today. It was kind of dangerous and stupid, but I did it anyways. Just love hooping. Anyways, Monster She Wrote is a fantastic history of genre science fiction writing, and really important stuff. And I learned about science fiction novels written by women in the 1600s, and I had no idea such a thing existed. Next was Sundial by Katrina Ward. I loved The House on Needless Street. I think that's what it was called. The last novel of hers that I read, I really, really liked. Sundial didn't work for me. The structure was weird. The story, it just didn't work for me. So I was just not a fan. But I loved the other one, so I'm going to keep reading her work. And next was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Again, the May-June issue came in the mail, and I read that one right away because it had a novella from Norman Spinrad, who's one of my favorite writers, and that one's a really cool novella about New York City, like in climate change, having to build up. So there's these walkways and paths, and people basically don't go down towards the ground. It's really, really, really good. Highly recommend that one. The next two are books that I covered on the podcast, and one of those is Insomnia by Sarah Pittenborough. And Sarah is one of my favorite writers. I will follow. She writes in a genre that's not really my thing, but I don't care. She started as a horror writer, and that's where I discovered her. But Sarah is one of the best pure storytellers, and she writes these subtly feminist thrillers. Like she writes in these like in the like kind of Gone Girl type women's thriller thing. And what's interesting about what Sarah does is that they're not like, like raise your fist in the air, like riot girl feminist stuff, but they're just like, just really great subtle feminism. And Insomnia is kind of like the monster of Insomnia is the 40th birthday of the main character and getting older, and which it's done in a very interesting way. It's really good. I loved Insomnia. And another writer from the UK and a friend of Sarah's, and was on the podcast twice this year for the Who Goes There episode, as well as covering this book, The Last Storm by Tim Levin. I still think The Silence is Tim Levin's masterpiece. Don't worry about the movie. The novel is incredible. And The Last Storm is kind of like, imagine Firestarter set against a climate change apocalypse. So it's like take Firestarter and The Road and kind of mix them together. But I don't know, a little bit crazier. Anyways, The Last Storm is a very good book. Highly recommended. Read Last Storm by Tim Levin. Next was Blood, Sweat, and Chrome, the wild and true story of Mad Max Fury Road by Kyle Buchanan. This is an amazing nonfiction book about the filming and the creation of Fury Road, which is one of my favorite movies of the last decade. I think one of the best theatrical experiences you could possibly have. So it's a really cool book. George Miller and everybody who made that movie is crazy. Next was a audiobook of Star Trek Discovery, The Enterprise War. This is the story of the Enterprise and Captain Pike leading up into Discovery season 2. And so it kind of explains some of the things that were going on, why the Enterprise was not involved in the Klingon War. And you find out why by this novel was written by John Jackson Miller, and the audiobook was really good, and I listened to it kind of like as Strange New Worlds was premiering every week, which was the best thing of the year. So so really good. Then I read Indiana's own Maurice Broaddus, his first of a trilogy called A Sweep of Stars. And this has been kind of billed as an Afrocentric version of The Expanse. And that's fair. It's a Afrofuturist space opera. And, wow, it's really good. It's really, really good. We'll be talking about it in the Best of the Year episodes. So I'm not going to go too deep into Sweep of Stars, but it's really, really good. And if you like space opera, space battles, world building, and all that, it's really good. Then I read Conditionally Human by Walter M. Miller Jr., the author of Canticle for Leibowitz. It's a 3-novella collection that I picked up at Artifact Books. Shout out to Greg at Artifact in Encinitas. And I read the first novella is kind of about animal rights and is very influential on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which at that time I was studying really intensely for working on an article. And we did 40th anniversary of Blade Runner coverage on the Dickheads podcast. So it really it has a lot of similarities to Android's Dream of Electric Sheep. And speaking of Philip K. Dick, in order for the it was referenced, I wrote a chapter about Ubik in my upcoming PKD book, which I can't tell you the title of. But for that chapter, I really needed to know about A World of Talent, which was a 42-page novella that Phil wrote in the 50s that kind of has some of the themes of Ubik in it. And so I had to reread that. And then Skyrim book 1 of the Sweetland Quartet by Dwayne Pouncey, who is a Portland author, sent me an arc of this very epic, and this is book 1, and this is a very strange and surreal sci-fi novel set in future Portland, and it has some kind of alt world, virtual world stuff, and it's very good. Yeah, I liked it. It didn't really make any of my best of lists, but it's up there. And yeah, so the next thing on my list was Star Trek Explorer magazine #2. This is a little bit of a cheat because it's not a book and it's really just a magazine, but there were stories in it. Greg Cox had a story in it about 7 of 9. And I read it cover to cover, so those pages count. So it counts towards my reading. I was kind of interested in looking at the magazine to see, because I'm working on some nonfiction stuff about Star Trek. I'm wondering if that would be a market for it, and it is not. But that's okay. They cover they were covering the upcoming Picard season 2, which I was not a big fan of. So, you know, I don't know. I keep reading Star Trek Explorer, and I think it's cool that they include fiction. Next is a book that I covered on the next 3 books are all ones that I covered on 1 or 2 of the podcast. The Fervor by Alma Katsu, who writes awesome historical horror. This is a historical horror novel that takes place during the internment of the Japanese in World War II and has some stuff to do with possible invasion of Oregon and some interesting real historical events. Yeah, it's cool. It has things going on. I just realized that the bananas are on the video, which is interesting. So I'm sorry to interrupt my Amakatsu, but yeah, bananas. We'll see if anyone watches this far, because then they'll definitely comment about bananas on the comments below. Yeah, so I interviewed Alma, and it's a cool book, and I like her work. I think I enjoyed Red Widow a little bit more, but that's spy thriller stuff, and it's very different. But she writes amazing historical horror. She does her research, but that's great. And another person I interviewed for the Dickheads podcast was Dr. Cheryl Vint of UC Riverside, right up the road. And her book, Animal Alterity, Science Fiction and the Question of the Animal. And it's a book about animal rights and science fiction. And I kind of started reading this long before like all the other ones that I finished, because it connects to the first novella of Conditionally Human by Walter M. Miller, which Cheryl writes a lot about. But I kind of took my time on this one. I read bits and pieces, partially because Cheryl wasn't available to do the interview until like later in the year. And then in Sweep of Stars, by the way, I read when I went to Portland. So we're in the summer now. And the next book is one I picked up in Portland at Powell's Books in Portland. And that is Northwest of Earth the collected stories of Northwest Smith, the character, by Catherine Lucille Moore, C.L. Moore, who was wife of Henry Kuttner. They were a writing team. I think she was the better half of the writing team, but I don't know, they're kind of interchangeable. Henry Kuttner was a great writer as well. I don't want to dismiss either one of them. But we covered the first story, the first novella in here, Chambleau, with Greg Cox and Cora Bullard for my 1930s science fiction series. So you're about to get the books from the 1930s series. And C.L. Moore is a fantastic writer, very similar to Lovecraft in style, because she was writing at this time. These stories were mostly for weird tales. And you can tell she transitioned to writing more types of science fiction stuff. She was also a screenwriter, and she wrote did a class at USC for many years. But C.L. Moore is from Indianapolis. She went to college and lived in the dorms very close to where I lived through middle school and high school. So C.L. Moore means a lot to me. Yeah, C.L. Moore. She's great. I feel like I didn't say enough about C.L. Moore. I took a little break, but we'll talk more about C.L. Moore in the best of the year. I did a whole episode about her, and I think you should listen to it. So next, I read a surreal British literary classic called They by Kay Dick. And that's kind of a surreal end of the world novel. It's okay. It wasn't terrible. It had some really creepy moments. It has kind of an interesting concept, but you know, I don't know. I don't have much to say about They by Kay Dick, but it sounded better than it was, but it is what it is. The next nonfiction book I read was J.G. Ballard by my homie David Harlan Wilson, Professor Wilson. And this is an incredible book about the writing work and life of J.G. Ballard. It's one of the modern masters of science fiction books. And yeah, I love that series. So yeah, whenever I can read any of those, I'm down for it. Next is a very popular book called Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazaterica. I don't know if I pronounced it right. She's a writer from Argentina, and this is a translated horror novel called Tender is the Flesh that is definitely about cannibalism and has whether it was unintentional or unintentional. It has some really interesting vegan subtext. And this was good, but not as good as I wanted it to be, and not as good as that hype. So, but it is good for sure. Next on my 1930s science fiction podcast series, I did an episode featuring Brian Keene, Mary San Giovanni, and Tim Leben talking about Who Goes There by John W. Campbell, originally published in the 1938 Astounding magazine. And I read a paperback that also includes an introduction by William F. Nolan and Nolan's screen treatment for excuse me, the movie of The Thing that happened before. And Nolan wrote his treatment and then they didn't use it, and then Bill Lancaster came in and wrote the script for John Carpenter. Anyways, it was interesting to read what Nolan wrote, but everyone should read Who Goes There. John W. Campbell was an odious person, but it's a really good novella. And the last of the audiobooks I listened to this year, I'm not a big audio guy, but I don't mind listening to Star Trek and Star Wars in audiobook because I just kind of consider those like tie-ins and more fun than anything. And so the last audiobook I listened to this year was The Captain's Oath a Star Trek the original series story featuring Kirk's first. I don't. It's a mission that involves the Enterprise, but he's still captain of another ship. By Christopher L. Bennett. Oh wait, I listened to one audiobook after this one, and it was a Christopher L. Bennett one. We'll get to that in a little bit. This one was fun. It was cool. It plays a lot with Star Trek canon. And, next, I read a anthology edited by Yen Oi, OOI, I think. Ab Terra 2021, a science fiction anthology. And as far as I know, I'm the only person that's reviewed it. And former guest of the podcast from our science fiction, Asian science fiction in translation episode, Angus Stewart had a story in here, and he kind of tricked me into agreeing to. There's two other editors, Don Ostland and Harris A. Durrani wrote the forward. So anyways, he kind of tricked me into reading this because Angus has a story in there, and he said, do you want to read more Chinese science fiction? Which I'm all for reading more Chinese science fiction, but his novella was a science fiction story that took place in China. This is not Chinese science fiction writers. When he sent me the email, I thought he was offering me like a Broken Stars type anthology that was Chinese science fiction writers. And so I was a little disappointed and annoyed when the book came in the mail. And but it's not the greatest anthology, to be honest with you, and not just because I was annoyed that it wasn't what I was told, but Angus's story in there is pretty interesting, and it's not just because he's somebody that I've met, but it was a good one. There's a couple stories in there that were good. You'd have to go and look at my review of that, but it's not one I would tell you to go running towards. The next I read for the 30 science fiction podcast series is At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft, published over 3 issues of Astounding. Now, I have a paperback of it. I didn't read the whole paperback. I just read that novella. And, we did a whole podcast about it, but it is a classic for a reason. And yes, Guillermo del Toro desperately needs to make that. So the next thing that I read was Spock Must Die, Star Trek Adventures #1 by James Blish. James Blish is a very well-respected science fiction writer who I believe started in New York and then moved to England. He was living in England. Star Trek was not even on the air for him. He wrote he did adaptations of all the episodes as science fiction stories based on the scripts, having not seen the series. He had just started to see some of it when he was asked to write, which is the second but first real official adult themed Star Trek tie-in novel. And it's kind of a sequel to Errand of Mercy, the Organian episode, and there's multiple Spocks. It's pre-Tuvix. Very it's interesting because it's very out of date. The canon doesn't match with everything we know afterwards, which is one of the things that makes it interesting to me. And it's interesting to see James Blish trying to make it more hard sci-fi than the show actually was. So anyways, there's that going on. And then the next thing I read was also Star Trek, which was this is the real last audiobook I listened to, Living Memory. And it's an Uhura novel written by Chris L. Bennett. It's focused on Uhura, and my least favorite thing in all of the 70 odd some episodes of the original series, the one thing that I wish was not canon that I think is awful is when Nomad zaps the memory of Uhura and she has to like start off her life all over again. The fact that they didn't fix that irritates the crap out of me. It was a terrible thing they did to that character, and this whole novel is built off of that. So it's all built off something that I can't stand from canon. But there's good Uhura stuff, but at the same time, it's all built off an event that's one of my least favorite things that happens in all of Star Trek. So the next is The Book of Disappearance, which is a Palestinian science fiction novel by Ibstam Azim. I'm terrible at pronouncing. It's my dyslexia, I swear. The Book of Disappearance is a classic novel where one day all the Palestinians just disappear from Israel, from inside Israel and Israel Palestine, and weird stuff occurs. So, and it's basically about an Israeli reporter trying to figure out what happened to the Palestinians, um, and it's really like very smart political science fiction set in that setting. Next was a nonfiction rereading of Astounding, the John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction by Alec Neville Lee. I reread this in part because I was doing the 30 sci-fi thing. I also had a copy of Astounding, even though I read it from the library originally, so I needed to read it again so I could highlight it and so I could, do all those things. And I was having Alec back on the podcast. Alec was on the Dickheads podcast for our cancel culture episode, and I think for the Scholars Roundtable. So, anyways, we've podcasted before, but Alec came on the 30 sci-fi for one that I'll talk about here in a minute. And since I knew I was going to be doing that 30s one, I decided that was a good time to reread Astounding. So I reread Astounding. Next was the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, July-August 2022. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm going to have to look and see what were my favorite stories. My favorite stories were The Song of Lost Voices by Brian Trent, Garbage Girls. Oh, yeah, I remember that one. By Nick Wolven, and The Monster I Found in Third Grade by Paul Tobin. And again, I don't remember these short stories super well, but apparently those were my favorites. And the next thing that I read, which was for that 30 sci-fi podcast series and features Alec Neville Lee and Seth Heasley, and that was Rule 18 by Clifford D. Samac, which was published in 1938, one issue before Who Goes There. And it is a hilarious story about football and time travel and a football game between Mars and the Earth, and how Mars always kicks our ass because of their genetic differences. And the next I read was kind of a retelling of The Little Mermaid called Sun Daughters, Sea Daughters by Amy Ogden. It's a sci-fi adult novella, but anyways, it seemed to me like it was a retelling of The Little Mermaid with kind of sci-fi fantasy settings. It's pretty good. I didn't love it, but it's pretty good. And then I read Road of Bones by Christopher Golden, and this was a awesome horror novel about a ghost hunting crew who goes to this very remote road in Siberia and finds monsters. It's kind of like The Gray meets the found footage thing. Very good, very good. Christopher Golden, great writer. Then my next nonfiction read was Once Around the Block, the unauthorized autobiography of Robert Bloch. I learned a lot reading that. His connections to the Milwaukee science fictioneers, like Stanley Weinbaum and Frederick Brown, I didn't know anything about, and now I do. So that's why you read stuff like that. And that was really good. Then I read Phasers on Stun, How the Making and Remaking of Star Trek Changed the World. And this, yeah, I've been trying to connect with the author of this book because we have a lot of things in common, and I would like to have him on the podcast, but we'll see. if that happens. I already know the history of Star Trek really, really, really well. So there was only so much I learned, but it was cool to kind of see it all put together. And then the next thing I read was a novella called In the Watchful City by S. And I'm not sure how to pronounce this. Q Lai Lu. And this was a really cool, like Asian centric, um, like short sci-fi novel. It's like 200 pages, but it packs like a lot in. It's kind of it has the way I described it was non-binary bio cyberpunk meets Chinese fantasy. Yeah, it's cool. It's different. It's not like anything else you'll read, and I loved it. It was cool. Um, Next up was Aurora by David Koepp. And that David Koepp is the writer of Stir of Echoes, Panic Room. And I'm not going to say a lot about it because I talk about it in best of the. He's the only writer that had a best movie and best book on my list for the year. And he's just a great storyteller. There's just like little details that make this end of the world story about all the power going out because of a massive aurora ejection into a really interesting piece. It's very similar to his first movie, The Trigger Effect, with Kyle MacLachlan and Elizabeth Shue, which I need to see again because I like David Koepp. Anyways, the next thing I read was the Quester Tapes by Dorothy Fontana, DC Fontana, who was one of the best, if not the best, writers on Star Trek. She was the story editor during the end of the first season and through most of the second season. And I also read the next thing I read was her Star Trek novel, Vulcan's Glory, which is about Spock's first mission on the Enterprise. And that was really cool. Quester Tapes is not great. That was based on a 70s TV pilot that Gene Roddenberry and Gene Kuhn wrote that's basically the basis for Data. It was basically about an android in modern times in the 70s, and it doesn't really hold up very well. Vulcan's Glory I liked. It's very different from Strange New Worlds, but so some people have a problem with that. I liked it a lot. I was reading all this Dorothy Fontana because I'm working on a very long, detailed article about Dorothy Fontana, but you'll find out about that when it's published. And then I read What Mad Universe by Frederick Brown. And I read this because I heard of him because he was in a local writers group with Robert Bloch. And I read the Robert Bloch autobiography. He wrote the story that the Arena episode of Star Trek was based off of, or well, not based off of. It was so similar they paid him for it. What Mad Universe is kind of a satirical, funny science fiction novel. Has the best about the author photo in the first edition from 1949, which that's the copy they had at my library was the 1949 first edition hardcover, and it had been in the San Diego library since 1949, which is crazy. And it's pretty funny. It doesn't hold up. It's very out of date, but if you're okay reading out of date science fiction, which I am, it's very funny, and you can see why Frederick Brown was popular. This book I kind of sort of didn't finish because I really didn't like it, and that was The Last White Man by Mohsin Hamid. And I heard about this on NPR, and it sounded really interesting, and it was not. It was poorly written, in my opinion. There was very little narrative drive, and it was a story about all the white men suddenly becoming men of color, which is a cool idea, which is a really interesting thing to explore. I just didn't think the execution was very good. Yeah, thumbs down. Nope, no thanks. No narrative drive at all whatsoever. Then I read what's one of the best 21st century science fiction novels, which is Blind Sight, which is by Peter Watts. I don't like Blind Sight as much as Freeze Frame Revolution, his book, shorter book that came out since then. That I think is absolutely incredible Blind Sight is one of those books where when I was reading it, I didn't really like that much, but the more you think about it, you like it more and more and more. I realized that it is an incredible work, and probably better than I personally liked it. But it's a great first contact novel. It's incredible. So next I read These Are the Voyages, the original series, season 1 by Mark Cushman. This is the most detailed history and accounts of the creation of the Star Trek series, and I read season 1 and 2 for my DC Fontana article. And these books are incredible, and I got them from the library, and I need to own them. I will own them. I will get them at some point. Next was Axel Bust Creek by John Shirley. By the way, that painting was painted by John Shirley, and he sent to me, which is really cool. It was a nice gift. Yeah, very cool. Anyways, this is the beginning of a train of some John Shirley that I read. And Axel Bust Creek is a very standard, regular Western. He's starting a Western series. It has John's sense of justice, and there's one scene that involves a hanging that is really, really incredible. I prefer when John writes science fiction, but I'm happy to read his Westerns. He's one of those authors I'll follow to any genre. Another one of those authors is Stephen King. That being said, Fairy Tale was garbage. I did not finish this book, admittedly, but the first 200 pages were meandering and just basically a retelling of a novella that I read earlier in the year. And if it bleeds, the whatever Mr. So-and-so's phone with the old guy or with the young kid who helps take care of the old guy. And then it's the same setup. We just did this. Let's go. And if you're going to spend 200 pages doing nothing but setup, and then here's the thing, I had a coworker who'd read it, who's a big Stephen King fan. And when she was like, yeah, if you don't like the first 200 pages, you're not going to like the rest of it. And life was too short and I had too much I wanted to read. So I DNF'd Fairy Tale. But it's a book I read. I read a whole book's worth of book. There's just only 1/3 of it in the end. So you can discount this as one. You can say I read 99, whatever. If that's your opinion, whatever. The magazine of fantasy and science fiction, the September-October issue. This one had a Molly Tanzer story in it. I love Molly. Molly was on the Dickheads podcast when she was a judge for the Philip K. Dick Award. So, yeah, Molly's story was great. I was really excited to see her in there. It's really cool. It's cool to get one of her stories in my mailbox. So, David Koepp, who wrote Aurora, I went back and read his first novel, Cold Storage, which is way more horror. If this book had Brian Keene's name on it, no one would have batted an eye. But because David Koepp wrote it, it wasn't marketed as horror, even though he refers to it as a horror novel in the acknowledgments. It was it's kind of a Andromeda strainish, but really, really intense horror novel. And yeah, oh man, we're getting to the last month here. Then I read Valis by Philip K. Dick and this just to show you, we did almost the whole year. We did very little Dickheads podcast this year because of health issues for one of our hosts. And so I only read 2 PKD books this year. I read a lot of books about PKD, but I only read Scanner Darkly and Valis. So, and I'm not going to talk about Valis because we are recording in 16 days the episode for the Dickheads podcast because we're back. We're going to finish off the last couple novels of his life, and that starts with Valis. So, yeah, that's coming up. Then we lost Greg Bear, who passed away in November. And so I read his classic well, he has a classic short story, Blood Music, that he turned into a novel, and I read the novel, Blood Music. It's incredible. It's a classic for a reason. It's science fiction horror. It's hard sci-fi horror. It's really good. Then I read Gabino Iglesias's The Devil Takes You Home, which is kind of like a barrio noir. Very good, brutal crime novel. Yeah, loved it. You can tell we're getting towards the end. And then a short novella by friend of the podcast, Grant Walmack, who was just you can hear on the podcast where I decided to buy this book because Grant pitches this book to us went in the Nightmare City bonus podcast episode, and I said I gotta get that, and it's great. And I gotta read Desmond's novel, The Mother of Abominations. That's on my list for early next year. And God's Leftovers is a brutal, like kind of surrealist, Hills Have Eyes ish kind of thing. Very, very, very good. And then I read House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgins. I was invited to write, I don't know if I'll make it, but I was invited to submit a story for a tribute anthology to William Hope Hodgins. So I needed to read his masterwork again. So I did. And it's 1908 and incredible. Then I read a graphic novel by DC Fontana called Star Trek Year 4, The Enterprise Experiment. For my article, it was fun. It's a comic book. It has Eric's guy with the third arm. I like it. Then I read Sense of Wonder by Kermit Woodall and Steve Davidson. There's a podcast episode coming soon to talk about this book they did called Sense of Wonder, which was about the 1926 and 1929 Amazing Stories short story contests. And so I read that. And then we're getting to the end here, folks. Then Galaxies by Barry Ann Maltzberg. We have an episode we've already recorded with James Reich, author James Reich, and author D. Harlan Wilson, who published through his press, AOP, Anti-Oedious Press. He republished Galaxies. And so we have a Barry Maltzberg podcast. We recorded it. It's coming. It'll be episode 101. I had to check my notes. Then I read Virtual Zen because we lost Ray Faraday Nelson, who's most famous for writing the story that They Live was based off of. But he was one of Phil's best friends in the 60s. They co-wrote the Ganymede Takeover together. And Ray Nelson wrote a really strange novel called Virtual Zen, which is about, it takes place in a country that is Japan and California become one country. And then this guy becomes this major pop icon by playing a toy flute. Yeah, it's a weird book. But if you want to talk about ripped from today's headlines are talking about what's going on now, it's about AI generated art and this guy who is propped up as the front person for AI generated art by music. And just sing the songs, dude. And that's Virtual Zen. We got 4 left. Okay. Startling Stories Magazine, issue 2022. This is the classic magazine reprinted by Wildside Press, and it has a couple interesting stories and interviews and articles. It was sent to me by John Shirley because he has a really cool story in it called what's it called? It's about Los Angeles. It's a time travel story set in future Los Angeles, Destroy Los Angeles, and it's really good. I'm brain farting the title of it. But it also has an interview with John, and then there's a story about The Thing. It's basically a fan fiction riff-off of John Carpenter's The Thing, which apparently everyone's doing now because Sam Miller has one of those and Peter Watts has one of those. So, hey, let's all write our end to The Thing. And then Also the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, November, December. And that has a Sam Miller story and a John Shirley story. And so all the 2 John Shirley sci-fi stories I reviewed with Axel Bust Creek, because I went ahead and read those back around the time that I read Axel Bust Creek, and then just didn't finish reading them until recently. The last novel that I read in 2022 is Daphne by Josh Mallerman, friend of the podcast. He's been on twice before, 3 times before, because he came on and talked about basketball, which this book is about. It's a horror novel. This inciting incident is Ball Don't Lie. It's a basketball story. It's really good. It's a really cool horror novel, and it says a lot about anxiety and teenage issues. And why is Josh Mallerman so good at writing teenage women? I don't know, but he is really good at it. And Josh is just incredible. Josh is an incredible writer, and his success with Bird Box should not dissuade people from realizing that Josh is awesome. So we'll talk about this more in the best of. I haven't written my review yet, so I'll have more thoughts of it when I write my review. And the very last book that I still have to finish today is I Am Philip K. Dick by Lawrence A. Rickles, who I am interviewing. Today is Saturday. I'm interviewing him on Tuesday. So I had to finish reading this book. This is very important to my Philip K. Dick book. And that is the 100th book I read this year. So that's all 100 books I read this year. I'm going to shut the hell up. And anyways, I read 100 books, but I wrote one that came out this year. So last time, Nightmare City. Buy it. Read it. Review it, please. We really need the help. We worked for 4 years on this one. So we really want your help, support. So thank you. And we'll see you. We'll see. I'm going to set a goal of 110 for 2023. We'll see how I do.